A young mother stops answering her phone. Her family grows worried. Friends leave messages. Nobody hears back. When police finally enter the quiet suburban home, they discover a scene so heartbreaking that even experienced investigators struggle to describe it. A mother, a baby, both lying together beneath the blanket, and the one person who should have been searching for them was already thousands of miles away on a flight across the Atlantic. But what shocked investigators wasn't simply that he left. It was what they would soon discover he had been doing in the days, weeks, and months before the murders. Internet searches, secret debts, a hidden double life, and a trail of decisions that prosecutors would later argue revealed something terrifying. This wasn't a crime committed in panic. It was a crime committed with a plan. Tonight, we examine one of the most disturbing family murder cases of the 21st century. The story of a husband, a wife, a baby daughter, and a secret life that ended in tragedy. Because by the time the truth emerged, 2 innocent lives were already gone, and one question remained. Why? Long before her name appeared in headlines, Rachel was known for something very different. She was known for her kindness. Friends described her as energetic, warm, and deeply loyal. The type of person who remembered birthdays. The type of person who checked in on people when they were struggling. The type of person who believed the best about others. Born and raised in Massachusetts, Rachel grew up surrounded by family. Her parents worked hard to provide stability. Her home was close-knit. Family gatherings were common. Support was never far away. From an early age, Rachel loved books, storytelling, and the performing arts. Teachers noticed her enthusiasm. Classmates remembered her confidence. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, but people noticed her, especially when she spoke about her future. Rachel wanted a career that mattered. She wanted to help young people. She wanted to teach. As graduation approached, she set her sights on college. There, she pursued her education with determination. But no one could have predicted that one decision during her college years would eventually place her on a path leading halfway around the world, and toward the man who would ultimately change her life forever. During her university years, Rachel received an opportunity that many students dream about. Studying abroad, it meant leaving familiar surroundings, leaving family, leaving friends. But it also meant adventure, new experiences, a chance to see the world. When she arrived in England, everything felt different. The culture, the weather, the pace of life. For Rachel, it was exciting. She embraced the challenge. She joined student organizations, made new friends, built connections, and eventually became involved with a rowing club. It was there that she met a young engineering student named Neil. At first glance, Neil appeared promising, intelligent, educated, ambitious. He came from a hard-working family and seemed determined to build a successful future. The two quickly connected. Their relationship grew naturally. Friends saw a couple who appeared happy together. They spent time exploring England, sharing plans, discussing careers, talking about what their future might look like. Like many young couples, they imagined possibilities. A home, a family, a life together. What nobody knew then was how different reality would eventually become from those dreams. After completing her studies, Rachel faced a major choice. She could remain in the United States, or she could return to England. The decision wasn't easy, but love influenced her choice. Rachel moved back across the ocean. She left behind familiarity and comfort to build a future with Neil. It was a significant sacrifice, one that would shape the rest of her life. She pursued teaching, worked hard, established herself professionally. Students appreciated her dedication. Colleagues respected her work ethic. Meanwhile, the relationship continued to move forward. Eventually, the couple married. Family members celebrated. Friends congratulated them. Everything appeared to be moving exactly as planned. Years of effort seemed to be paying off. A loving relationship, stable careers, exciting opportunities ahead. Then came another major milestone, a baby. When their daughter was born, it seemed as though the couple had finally achieved everything they wanted. For Rachel, motherhood became the center of her world. Photos from that period show happiness, smiles, family moments, the ordinary scenes many parents treasure forever. Friends remember Rachel talking endlessly about her daughter. She was proud, protective, excited about the future. Like countless new mothers, she dreamed about milestones still to come. First words, first steps, first days of school. The future appeared bright, but behind the scenes, cracks were already beginning to form, not in Rachel's life, in Neil's, and those cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. One of the most frightening aspects of many family murder cases is how ordinary everything appears beforehand. Neighbors don't see it, friends don't suspect it, even spouses sometimes have no idea, because the person hiding secrets often becomes very good at pretending. And according to investigators, that's exactly what was happening here. On the surface, Neil projected confidence. He appeared capable, responsible, in control. But behind closed doors, a different picture was emerging. Financial problems, career struggles, mounting pressure, and a growing gap between reality and the image he presented to others. Investigators would later uncover evidence suggesting that Neil had spent years attempting various online business ventures. Many failed. Some generated little income. Others produced none at all. Yet despite these setbacks, he continued presenting himself as successful, as stable, as someone with a plan. The problem with maintaining a false image is that eventually reality catches up. Bills accumulate, expectations grow, questions become harder to answer, and the pressure intensifies. For some people, that pressure becomes overwhelming. For others, it becomes dangerous. By 2005, another major decision arrived. The family would relocate to Massachusetts. For Rachel, the move made sense. She wanted to be closer to family. She wanted her daughter to grow up surrounded by grandparents, relatives, and support. Starting over wouldn't be easy. But Rachel had done difficult things before. So once again, she packed her life into boxes. Once again, she crossed an ocean. Once again, she trusted that the future would be worth the sacrifice. Initially, the family stayed with relatives. Then, they began searching for a place of their own. Eventually, they found a large rental home in a quiet community. It looked like a fresh start, a chance to build stability, a chance to begin the next chapter. But investigators would later argue that while Rachel viewed the move as an opportunity, Neil viewed it as something else entirely, a deadline. Because by now, financial problems were growing worse, and maintaining appearances was becoming harder every day. The life he had presented to Rachel was beginning to unravel. What happened next would set the stage for everything that followed. And within weeks of moving into their new home, a chain of events would begin that would end in tragedy. But before investigators uncovered the truth, there would first be silence, a silence that grew more concerning with each passing hour, and a silence that would soon lead loved ones to make a devastating discovery. For most families, a missed phone call means very little. People get busy, phones die, plans change, life happens. But sometimes, the people closest to us notice when something feels different, not because of one missed call, but because of what that silence means coming from a specific person. Rachel was one of those people. She stayed connected, she called family regularly, she checked in, she responded to messages. She wasn't the type of person who simply disappeared, which is why concerns started growing almost immediately. The last conversation with Rachel seemed normal. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic. No indication that anything was wrong. She talked about upcoming plans. She sounded excited. Family members expected to hear from her again soon, but they didn't. Hours passed, then more hours. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. As concern increased, relatives tried to convince themselves there must be a simple explanation. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she had gone out. Maybe she was dealing with something unexpected. But deep down, something felt wrong. And that feeling refused to go away. Eventually, concern became serious enough that authorities were contacted. Police arrived at the family home. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The house appeared quiet, orderly, normal. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no evidence of a violent struggle, no indication that a horrific crime had occurred inside. Officers conducted a brief check. They looked around. They assessed what they could see, and then they left. Nothing immediately suggested danger. Nothing screamed homicide. Nothing revealed the truth hidden only feet away. Looking back, it's one of the most heartbreaking moments in the entire case, because unknown to everyone involved, Rachel and her daughter were already dead. Their bodies remained undiscovered, waiting, hidden in plain sight, as family members continued desperately searching for answers. Next day, concern intensified. The silence continued. Still no answer. Still no contact. Still no explanation. Family members couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. So authorities returned. This time, something caught an officer's attention. A smell. Subtle at first, but unusual enough to investigate further. Investigators moved through the house again, room by room, step by step, until they reached the master bedroom. What they discovered there would forever change everyone connected to the case. Beneath a comforter on the bed were two bodies, a mother and her baby daughter, together. The scene was almost surreal. There was no chaos, no obvious violence visible from a distance. Instead, it appeared as though they were sleeping. But they weren't. They had been dead for more than a day, and someone had deliberately covered them. As investigators processed the scene, one realization became immediately clear. This was not an accident. This was not natural causes. This was homicide. The details uncovered during the investigation were difficult even for experienced detectives. Rachel had suffered a fatal gunshot wound. Her infant daughter had also been shot. The cruelty of the crime shocked investigators. Family murders are always tragic, but cases involving children carry a particular weight. There are no words that fully capture the loss, no explanation that makes sense, no motive that feels adequate. Detectives now face two urgent questions: who committed the murders, and where was Rachel's husband? Because the one person who should have been there was gone. As investigators worked to establish a timeline, they made a startling discovery. Neil was no longer in Massachusetts. In fact, he was no longer in the United States. Records showed he had boarded a flight to England, not days after the murders, not after speaking with investigators, not after notifying family, before the bodies were discovered. That detail immediately drew attention. Most innocent people don't leave the country after discovering their spouse and child dead. Most people call emergency services. Most people seek help. Most people contact family. Most people stay. Neil did none of those things. Instead, he crossed an ocean. And as investigators dug deeper, the questions multiplied. Why leave? Why tell nobody? Why not report what happened? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly had occurred inside that house before he boarded the plane? Investigators eventually reached Neil by telephone. The conversation would become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire case. A veteran investigator delivered devastating news. Rachel and Lillian were dead. According to reports, Neil acknowledged that he already knew. That statement immediately raised eyebrows. How could he know? What exactly had he seen? What had happened before he left? As the conversation continued, Neil provided an explanation. He claimed he had discovered the bodies himself. According to his account, he found his wife and daughter already dead. He said he covered them. He said he became overwhelmed, and then he left. But investigators quickly noticed something troubling. There were gaps, important gaps, questions without answers, actions that seemed impossible to understand. Most people confronted with such a scene immediately call for help, even when death appears obvious, even when panic takes over. The instinct is almost universal. Call someone, tell someone, get help. Yet, according to Neil's own account, that never happened. Instead, he left the bodies behind and boarded an international flight. As detectives examined every aspect of Neil's life, they began uncovering information that painted a far more complicated picture. At first, the family had appeared ordinary: a husband, a wife, a baby daughter. But the deeper investigators looked, the more concerning details emerged. Financial records, employment history, online activity, personal relationships. Everything came under scrutiny, and what they found suggested that Neil had been carrying enormous pressure he had carefully hidden from nearly everyone around him. Friends believed he was managing, family believed he was succeeding, but investigators discovered evidence indicating a much different reality, one marked by mounting debt, broken expectations, and a future that may have been collapsing faster than anyone realized. Then, detectives uncovered something that dramatically changed the direction of the investigation: a digital trail. Computers often tell stories, people don't. Search histories, websites visited, questions typed into search engines. Investigators began reconstructing Neil's online activity. What they found was disturbing. Searches involving death, searches involving violence, searches involving suicide, searches involving sexual encounters and escort services. Individually, some searches might seem insignificant. Together, they painted a troubling picture, especially when viewed alongside the timeline investigators were building, because these searches weren't occurring months after the murders, they were occurring before them. And that distinction mattered a lot. Prosecutors would later argue that these searches revealed a mindset, a glimpse into what Neil was thinking before Rachel and Lillian were killed. Whether viewed as planning, fantasy, desperation, or something else entirely, the timing was impossible to ignore, and detectives were becoming increasingly convinced that they were dealing with something far darker than a tragic accident. As evidence accumulated, investigators identified what they believed was a major theme running through Neil's life: secrets, financial secrets, professional secrets, personal secrets. The image he projected and the reality he lived appeared increasingly different. Maintaining those lies required constant effort, constant explanations, constant deception. The larger the gap became, the harder it was to sustain, and eventually every hidden life reaches a breaking point. Investigators believed they were getting closer to understanding where that breaking point occurred. But understanding motive wasn't enough. They still needed proof that could stand in court, proof that could convince a jury, proof that connected Neil directly to the murders. And as the detectives continued examining the evidence, they were about to find exactly that. The breakthrough would come from a weapon, a firearm connected to someone the family trusted, a weapon that should never have been involved in this tragedy. And once forensic scientists completed their analysis, the case would change forever. For investigators, suspicion is never enough. You can have a theory, you can have a timeline, you can have behavior that doesn't make sense, but in a murder case, none of that matters unless the evidence can support it. And during the first weeks of the investigation, detectives worked around the clock to find exactly that. Every room inside the house was examined, every object was photographed, every possible lead was followed. Forensic specialists collected fingerprints, DNA, experts processed evidence, computer analysts reviewed digital records. Slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle began coming together. Then came the breakthrough. The firearm investigators believed had been used in the murders was traced back to a gun cabinet belonging to Rachel's stepfather. It wasn't a weapon owned by a stranger. It wasn't connected to a criminal organization. It was a firearm from within the family's own circle. That discovery immediately raised new questions. Who had access to it? Who knew where it was kept? And who knew how to use it? As investigators searched for answers, witnesses provided information that would prove extremely important. Months earlier, Neil had gone target shooting with his father-in-law. According to testimony, he had been shown how to load, handle, and fire several weapons, including the revolver investigators now believed had ended 2 lives. The significance of that detail couldn't be ignored, because the defense would eventually argue that Neil wasn't familiar with firearms, but witnesses were prepared to tell a different story. And forensic science was about to make the prosecution's case even stronger. Television crime dramas often make forensic evidence look instant. A sample goes into a machine. Minutes later, investigators get answers. Real life isn't like that. Real forensic work takes time, patience, precision. And in this case, it would provide one of the most important pieces of evidence. Scientists carefully examined the firearm, the ammunition, and items associated with the weapon. What they discovered became a turning point. DNA linked Neil to critical components connected to the gun. At the same time, forensic evidence linked Rachel to the muzzle area. To prosecutors, the findings supported one conclusion. Rachel had come into contact with the weapon at the moment she was shot. Meanwhile, Neil's DNA appeared in places investigators expected to find it if he had handled the firearm. The evidence wasn't standing alone. It was fitting into an already growing timeline, a timeline that investigators believed showed preparation, execution, and escape. With every new result, their confidence increased, and soon they felt they had enough to take the next major step. While detectives worked in Massachusetts, Neil remained in England. For weeks, he lived thousands of miles away from the crime scene, but distance wasn't protecting him. The investigation was advancing rapidly. American authorities coordinated with British law enforcement. Evidence was shared, statements were reviewed. Legal procedures began moving forward. Behind the scenes, investigators were building an international case. Then came the announcement. Authorities believed they had probable cause. An arrest warrant was issued. The investigation had officially entered a new phase. No longer a mystery, no longer a search for possible suspects. Detectives now believed they knew exactly who was responsible. The only question was whether they could bring him back. News spread quickly. The husband, who had left the country before the bodies were discovered, was now wanted for murder. British authorities moved to locate him. When they finally did, the arrest happened without the dramatic confrontation many people imagine. No chase, no standoff, no violent resistance. Instead, officers approached and took him into custody. Witnesses later described the arrest as calm, controlled, routine. But there was nothing routine about what had led to that moment. A husband accused of killing his wife and infant daughter, a case attracting attention on both sides of the Atlantic, and a mountain of evidence continuing to grow. As Neil entered custody, investigators knew the most difficult phase was still ahead. Because making an arrest is one thing, securing a conviction is another. Extradition proceedings followed. Legal arguments were presented, documents were reviewed. Authorities worked it through the international process required to return Neil to the United States. Eventually, he agreed not to fight extradition. That decision surprised some observers. Others viewed it as inevitable. Either way, the result was the same. Neil was returned to Massachusetts, the place where investigators believed the murders occurred, the place where Rachel and Lillian had lost their lives, the place where a jury would eventually hear the evidence. When he arrived, cameras followed every movement, reporters gathered, questions filled the air, but answers remained elusive. The man at the center of the case wasn't talking publicly, and the silence only fueled speculation. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they continued examining every aspect of Neil's life. The deeper they looked, the more troubling the picture became. To friends and family, he often appeared composed, responsible, educated, a husband and father building a future. But behind that image, investigators found a series of struggles he had allegedly concealed. Financial records suggested growing debt. Employment records revealed uncertainty. Business ventures repeatedly failed to produce meaningful success. Yet somehow, the appearance of stability continued. Prosecutors would later argue that Neil had become trapped inside the image he created. Every month brought new pressure. Every financial setback required another explanation. Every disappointment widened the gap between reality and appearance. The situation wasn't improving, it was deteriorating, and according to the prosecution, he knew it. One of the most controversial aspects of the case involved Neil's online activity. Investigators uncovered websites, searches, and digital behavior that painted a picture far different from the devoted family man many people believed they knew. Adult websites, escort-related searches, fantasy lifestyles far removed from the responsibilities of marriage and parenthood. The prosecution didn't present these findings simply to embarrass him. They argued the evidence revealed motive. A man increasingly dissatisfied with reality. A man pursuing escape. A man living in two worlds simultaneously, one public, one private. Whether those behaviors directly caused the murders remained a matter of debate, but prosecutors believed they helped explain what happened. They argued the evidence showed someone desperately trying to maintain control over a life that was falling apart. And when maintaining that illusion became impossible, everything changed. Murder prosecutions rarely depend on one dramatic piece of evidence. Instead, they depend on accumulation. 100 details, 1,000 facts, each one supporting the next. By the time prosecutors prepared for trial, they believed they had exactly that: a timeline, a motive, forensic evidence, digital evidence, witness testimony, behavior before the murders, behavior after the murders, the flight to England, the failure to contact emergency services, the firearm, the DNA. Individually, each detail mattered. Together, prosecutors argued they told a story of planning, a story of deception, and ultimately a story of murder. But before a jury could decide what really happened, another story would emerge, one presented by the defense, a story that would attempt to explain away every suspicious fact, a story that would place responsibility somewhere else entirely. And when jurors finally heard it, they would face one of the most important decisions of their lives. As trial preparations intensified, defense attorneys worked to create reasonable doubt. Their job wasn't necessarily to prove exactly what happened. Their job was to challenge the prosecution's version of events, to ask questions, to expose weaknesses, to offer alternative explanations. And eventually, they developed a theory that would become central to their case, a theory that shocked many observers, a theory that suggested investigators had reached the wrong conclusion from the very beginning. If accepted, it would completely transform the narrative surrounding the murders, but convincing a jury would require overcoming an enormous obstacle: the physical evidence. Because while attorneys can argue interpretations, science is much harder to explain away, and soon experts would take the witness stand. What they revealed would become one of the most critical moments of the entire trial. More than 2 years passed between the murders and the start of trial. For Rachel's family, the wait felt endless. Every hearing reopened old wounds. Every legal motion prolonged uncertainty. Every delay postponed justice. Yet they remained determined. They attended proceedings. They followed developments. And they prepared themselves for what would likely be the most painful chapter of all: reliving everything in open court. Meanwhile, prosecutors finalized their strategy. Witnesses were organized. Evidence was reviewed. Experts prepared testimony. The stakes could not have been higher, because soon 12 jurors would enter a courtroom, and those 12 people would be asked to answer a question that had haunted this case from the beginning. Who killed Rachel and Lillian? The answer would determine the fate of a man accused of one of the most shocking family murders in modern Massachusetts history. And when the trial finally began, the courtroom would become the stage for a battle neither side could afford to lose. More than 2 years had passed since Rachel and Lillian were found inside the home. For Rachel's family, time had not made anything easier. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived and passed. The empty spaces remained. The unanswered questions remained. And now, at last, a jury would hear the evidence. The courtroom was packed. Family members sat quietly. Reporters filled the gallery. Attorneys organized stacks of documents. The man accused of killing his wife and daughter sat only a few feet away. For many people watching, it was the first time they had seen him in person since the investigation began. What stood out wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. Observers repeatedly described him as emotionless, calm, detached, almost impossible to read. But while his expression revealed little, prosecutors intended to reveal everything. The prosecution strategy was simple: take jurors through the final days of Rachel and Lillian's lives. Step by step, minute by minute, decision by decision. Witnesses described Rachel as excited about the future. She had plans, family visits, upcoming events, things she was looking forward to. Nothing suggested hopelessness. Nothing suggested violence. Nothing suggested she was planning to harm herself or her child. The prosecution emphasized this repeatedly. Rachel wasn't withdrawing. She wasn't saying goodbye. She wasn't showing signs of someone preparing for death. Instead, she was making plans for life. That distinction became important because the defense would soon present a dramatically different explanation. Among the most emotional moments of the trial came when Rachel's mother took the stand. The courtroom fell silent. Every parent fears receiving terrible news. Few can imagine losing both a child and a grandchild at the same time. As she testified, jurors listened carefully. She described Rachel's personality, her hopes, her devotion to her daughter. She spoke about family gatherings, conversations, dreams that would never be realized. Then came the painful discussion of the firearm, the gun cabinet, the target shooting trips, the trust extended to a son-in-law who would later become the focus of a murder investigation. For many observers, it was one of the most heartbreaking moments of the trial. A mother forced to revisit the worst chapter of her life in front of strangers. Prosecutors introduced recordings and testimony related to Neil's statements after the murders. Jurors listened carefully, not just to what he said, but to how he said it. His explanations, his reactions, his account of events. Investigators highlighted what they viewed as inconsistencies, questions that remained unanswered, behavior that seemed difficult to explain. Why leave? Why not call for help? Why travel internationally? Why make no immediate effort to alert authorities? The prosecution argued these weren't the actions of an innocent husband overwhelmed by tragedy. They were the actions of someone trying to escape the consequences of what had happened. The defense strongly disagreed, and soon they presented their own theory. Defense attorneys faced an enormous challenge. The evidence was substantial. The timeline was damaging. The flight to England raised serious questions. But their job wasn't to prove innocence beyond all doubt. Their job was to create reasonable doubt. They argued investigators had reached the wrong conclusion. According to the defense, another explanation existed, one they believed could not be completely ruled out. It was a theory that shocked many people following the case. A theory that shifted responsibility away from Neil entirely. The courtroom listened carefully. Jurors took notes, experts were questioned, arguments intensified. Yet ultimately, everything would come down to one critical issue. Did the physical evidence support the defense theory or destroy it? Forensic experts became some of the most important witnesses in the entire trial. Unlike emotional testimony, forensic evidence is rooted in measurable facts, angles, distances, trajectories, physical realities. Experts explained what they observed, how the evidence was collected, what conclusions could reasonably be drawn. Then came one of the most dramatic moments. Jurors were asked to carefully consider whether the defense theory was physically possible. Not emotionally possible, physically possible. Could the events have occurred the way the defense suggested? Could the positions, angles, and injuries align with that explanation? Set. The answer, according to the prosecution's experts, was no, and that conclusion carried enormous weight. Because if the defense theory collapsed, very little remained to challenge the prosecution's version of events. After days of testimony and weeks of preparation, the case finally reached the jury. 12 people, one room, one decision. They reviewed the evidence, discussed witness testimony, examined timelines, considered expert analysis. Hours passed, then more hours. For Rachel's family, every minute felt longer than the last. Nobody knew what would happen. Nobody could predict how the jury would rule. Then, finally, a verdict was reached. The courtroom filled once again. Everyone stood. The tension was overwhelming. Jurors entered, the verdict forms were handed over, and the clerk began reading. Guilty on the first count, guilty on the second count. The jury had unanimously concluded that the murders were deliberate and planned. For Rachel's family, the verdict brought relief, but not closure, because some losses can never truly be repaired. Following the verdict, the court moved to sentencing. Family members were given an opportunity to speak. Their words were powerful, heartbreaking, and unforgettable. They spoke about birthdays that would never be celebrated, memories that would never be created, the future that had been stolen, a daughter, a granddaughter, gone forever. Many people in the courtroom struggled to maintain composure. The emotional weight was impossible to ignore. When the judge finally addressed the defendant, her message was clear. The crimes were extraordinary in their cruelty. The consequences would be permanent. The sentence ensured that Neil would spend the rest of his life behind bars. No parole, no second chance, no opportunity to return to the life he once knew. The verdict did not end the legal battle. Appeals followed, arguments were reviewed, higher courts examined the record. Defense attorneys continued fighting the conviction, but each challenge failed. Court after court upheld the verdict. The conviction remained intact. The sentence remained intact. And eventually, every avenue for relief was exhausted. The legal system had spoken, the case was over, at least in the eyes of the law. For Rachel's family, however, the story didn't end in a courtroom. They faced a different challenge. How do you move forward after something like this? How do you carry unimaginable grief while continuing to live your life? Many families never find an answer. Rachel's family chose action. They dedicated themselves to helping others, advocating against domestic violence, supporting efforts to protect children, educating communities, turning unimaginable pain into something meaningful. It could never replace what was lost. Nothing could. But it ensured that Rachel and Lillian would be remembered for more than the circumstances of their deaths. They would be remembered through the lives they continued to impact. Even after convictions, appeals, and years of investigation, some questions never receive complete answers. The evidence can explain what happened. The timeline can explain when it happened. But understanding why is often much harder. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is how ordinary everything appeared from the outside. A family, a home, a future. The image was convincing, until suddenly it wasn't. Cases like this remind us that violence inside a family often grows in silence, behind closed doors, hidden beneath appearances, concealed by routines and smiles. And by the time the truth becomes visible, it is sometimes already too late. Rachel trusted the man she built her future with. Lillian trusted the people responsible for protecting her. Neither got the future they deserved. Today, the house is just another address. The court files sit in archives. The headlines have faded. But for those who loved Rachel and Lillian, time stopped the moment they were taken away. Their story remains a reminder of how quickly hidden troubles can become irreversible tragedy, and perhaps that is why this case continues to resonate all these years later. Not because of the mystery, not because of the investigation, but because at the center of it all were two innocent lives that should still be here today. Thank you for watching. If this story impacted you, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. And if you enjoy in-depth true crime documentaries that focus on the victims, consider subscribing for more stories every week. We'll see you in the next case.